Still with me? Okay, my last section is market prospects. So we talked about how this could include industry-focused things, but for this specifically, we're going to talk about intra-company things as far as market, but in relation to the market. So your dividend yield and your price-earnings ratio are something that you can calculate for a company to then compare it to other companies' same ratios. We're not going to do the actual formulas for these. I'm not going to make you calculate them because we're not going to do price per share in this class. I just want you to know that they exist. So we're playing? Maybe? Okay, so I need to title these real quick. Okay, so here's where it gets kind of interesting. Here's where the vocab kind of starts to roll. We are going to start naming types of costs. So you remember in financial accounting when we started talking about assets, liabilities, and equity, and it's like if you can't speak in terms of assets, liabilities, and equity, this class is going to get kind of rough. This is where it kind of starts to hit the road. If you cannot speak in terms of the type of cost, then as I'm talking, you're going to have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's really important that you understand the distinction between types of costs. So today would be a good day to ask me questions if you are lost. So I've got multiple types of costs we're going to cover this particular semester. We're going to start with these. So the main thing, and we're going to talk about it in terms of a manufacturing company because that's the easiest to think about. I've got direct costs and indirect costs. So the main distinction is a direct cost is something I can directly trace to the product that I make. So somebody pick a product we want to make today.
Shredded cheese.
Shredded cheese, perfect. Okay. What are the direct costs to producing shredded cheese?
Milk.
Milk.
Electricity.
Okay. So here, let me ask you a question. Can I trace the amount of milk to the shredded cheese that I make? So if I buy milk, do I know exactly how much milk I need, measurement-wise, to produce a certain amount of shredded cheese? Who doesn't know anything about shredded cheese in here? Okay, so can I alter? Can I alter your good?
Sure.
Do you know how a cake is baked? Yeah? Okay, so what goes in a cake? Eggs. What else? Sugar. Flour. What? Does milk go on a cake? Do I look like I bake cakes? I don't know. Does milk go on a cake? Okay. What else? I was looking for more like box, mix, and egg. No, okay. We could have done that, but it makes it a little harder. Anything else in here? Vanilla. Baking powder. Baking powder. Sure it's not baking soda. I'm joking. I don't know the difference. Okay. Does this suffice for what makes a cake? If we're missing something? What else do you need to make a cake? So you stir all this together and then what happens? Okay, you need a pan. What else? Oven. How does the oven work? Okay. Does it do it itself?
Labor.
You need a baker, yeah? Okay, each of these things can fall into one of these two categories. So name for me off this list my direct costs. What can I trace directly to the product?
The eggs.
I know exactly how many eggs I used. Do I know how much sugar I used? Flour? So the ingredients pretty much make up the direct cost, yeah? Okay, here's where it gets a little tricky. What do I do with the baker? Because you told me over here that salaries go in the other expense. So direct costs are up here, what it costs me to make it, right? Indirect costs can go down here. You told me salaries go down here, but is the baker related to the cake or not? Okay, so there's a distinction for labor. If that person touched the good, or did the service, they are a direct labor cost. If they didn't, if they supervised the baker, they're an indirect cost. Does that make sense? So the baker, himself or herself, is a direct cost. The bakery manager, whatever, department manager, is an indirect cost. Make sense? Okay, so how about the pan? Do what?
Indoor.
Okay, why?
Because you reuse it.
Because I reuse it. Is that what you said? Okay.
Could it be an asset if it's like a super nice pan, you know? Like, is it a supplier, an asset, versus a cost?
I'm gonna veto the pan, but I'll go with this one.
Okay.
So this one would be an asset, right? All these things would be things that you buy for an expense. Here's where it gets kind of wonky in this class, which we haven't gotten to this slide yet, but to follow your train of thought. Everything you buy to make the good that you sell as inventory starts out as an asset. So if I'm a baker, I probably don't buy a single bag of sugar, right? I buy a pallet of sugar, buy a pallet of flour, 6 pallets of flour, whatever it is. Everything you have starts out as an asset on the balance sheet. So we haven't gotten there yet, but it's a good thought. So the oven particularly is an asset, right? But the oven itself, the use of it down here is an indirect cost. Or an overhead cost. What's an overhead cost?
Something you know you have to pay.
Okay, so overhead's a really tricky area for people in this class. So the more we do the examples, the more you'll see. An overhead cost is the idea that some things need to happen for the factory to run, but they're not directly touching the product.
Did you say electricity was indirect or direct?
Indirect.
Okay. Thank you.
For right now, yeah. Then we're gonna go to overhead. Does overhead make sense? Do you have overhead in your life? What is it? Do you live somewhere? Your rent's probably your overhead. You pay for utilities. For your living space to work for you, you have to pay it. But could you live there without it? Probably. Does the difference make sense? You sure? Promise? Okay, so this particular book loves bicycles. So the example here would be the direct cost for a bicycle would be tires, seats, handlebars, the same thing we did with the cake, right? The thing that actually goes on the bike. The indirect costs end up being things like factory accounting, administration, so on and so forth. So things that have to happen for the business to run in its entirety, but don't actually have to happen for the bicycle to be produced. Okay, so with indirect costs, I have a subsection of costs called product costs. Okay, so my first type of product cost is called direct materials. And I literally mean the cost to create the product. Nope. Sorry. Okay, so my costs to create my products start out with my direct materials. So literally the things that are the ingredients to go into whatever I make. So if I make bicycles, it would be, depending on how granular I get, the metal, the rubber, whatever. If I'm buying the parts already made by some other manufacturer, it would be the seat, the tires, the handlebars, the frame, the wheels, so on and so forth. Cables, that's the one I forget. Still easy enough? Make sense? So you sort of think about these things in your regular life, you just don't call them these things. Like, you know what goes into things, and you think about like, oh, that's the thing that makes it expensive. So like your iPhone, for example, if you have one, or your Android, but iPhone's a better example because of the price point on it. What's the thing that makes the iPhone expensive? Other than its brand. Yeah.
Would that be the gold used?
Could be. What specifically makes the iPhone expensive versus any other phone you buy?
Is it just the computing chip, like how small it is? Or
So part of it's the brand, right? You're buying it because it's Apple, but the chip is probably similar to every other chip. What does the chip run?
iOS.
The software is the expensive piece, right? So it's the device that you pay for, but it holds the actual software that allows you to work on an OS system. Does that make sense? So you think about that in terms of like your regular life. You just don't call it a direct material. Okay, we good with this one? My second part's direct labor. So I use direct labor to convert the material into the good. Okay, what do you think my third component is? So I know that it takes things, pieces. I know it takes a person to compile those pieces. What's the third piece that makes the product?
Logistics.
What?
Like logistics.
Could be. But before I get it to the point where I can ship it. So this is all work in process, right? I bought these things, they're not yet the good I'm making. So what did we choose to make? We choose cakes, let's choose something else. Why can I never think of a good? It's not. So the direct labor encompasses within it use of equipment, but I'm going to put the use of that in a category called something. So when I use the oven to bake the cake, or I use the equipment to manufacture something, or I use the Cricut to make a t-shirt, right? What do I call the piece that wraps it all together? Do it.
Packaging.
Packaging. Overhead. Factory overhead. So where do those people put the parts together? Do I ship it to their home? Do they work from their home? Where do they work? Okay, so anything that has to do with running the warehouse for them to complete this purpose is a product cost. So I've got something called factory overhead. Okay, so humor me for a second. What's a direct cost at Tarleton? Direct.
Campus.
All of campus is a direct cost?
That was Tarleton,
Okay, so here's my question. To be able to tell me what a direct cost is, to be able to tell me what a product cost is, you have to know what the product is, right? So what is the product of Tarleton?
Education.
Is it the education itself?
It's educated individuals.
It's the person who leaves, right? The product of Tarleton is the graduate. Does that make sense? Okay, so how do I build the graduate? Okay, so it could be faculty salaries, right? That would be direct labor.
Their
What else?
classes.
The class, so the actual slot for the class, also related to faculty salaries. What else?
Teaching material?
Okay, so the things that you come in that you actually use. Can you think of anything else that's direct cost? Okay, so let's go this route. If the content's the direct material and the faculty's the direct labor of the graduate, what's the overhead? Literally everything, right? So the building that you're sitting in right now, the lights, the AC, the heat, the tables, the carpet, all the furnishings, it's all overhead. It doesn't necessarily have to be that specific carpet for you to graduate, right? But the building has to be furnished in such a way where the two top things can work together to produce the graduate. Does that make sense? So if we didn't have a space for us to meet and talk about this, could I put the content plus my labor together, plus the building together to produce the graduate? No, right? So factory overhead, although often overlooked, is one of the most important parts. When you think about the bakery and the cake, you think the cake is the important thing, right? It's the good. But if you didn't have the place to bake the cake, what are we talking about? Does it make sense what overhead is? Okay. Give me an example of a business with a ton of overhead.
Data storage,
How so?
just property, just massive warehouses and then like millions of processors and stuff.
And it just sits, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a business with virtually no overhead?
Those services,
Like
tutor,
what?
a tutor.
Okay.
No overhead.
How so?
I mean, you don't have to pay for somewhere to be. You can show up at a library. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much their dollars. So.
A tutor's a great example, right? You can travel anywhere, you can do it from anywhere, and generally you're not using your own space. So unless you meet someone in your house that you pay for, if you go and meet at a public place and you use a public computer there. So if you go to the library here, you use a computer that's already in the library, you meet with the person, you don't pay for the space, you don't pay for the computer, literally you just show up. So all you pay for is your time, and your time is compensated by the person paying you to tutor them. Does that make sense? So you have businesses with a ton of overhead to be able to run. Car dealerships are like that, right? They pay for a ton of space to house cars. They buy a bunch of inventory and it sits there, and then they pay people to stand there and wait for people to show up in a lot. Then you have things that have virtually no overhead. If you were like a pest control person with a single truck and you buy the materials and you literally only go when you're called, you have virtually no overhead because you don't have a building. You basically live and work out of the truck. And as long as you have the materials to cover the job and you're making enough on it, then you're profitable. Does the distinction make sense? Okay, so if I keep moving through this, if I have these three components on top in yellow that are product costs, which matters a lot to you, so like I can ask a question about these three things individually, or I can say, what's the amount of your product costs? And you would have to know that these three things make up your product costs. So if I take the three things on top in yellow that are product costs, I can break them into two separate sections. So my product costs are comprised of prime costs and conversion costs. So here's how I think about it. When you buy your direct materials, they are an asset to you, and they're sitting waiting to be manufactured. Do they have value to you at that point? They do, right? Not the end value that you want them to have, but if you're a baker and you bought the flour, you bought the sugar, you bought the eggs, so on and so forth, those things intrinsically have their own value. They are an asset to you. Now, until you convert them to the cake, you can't sell them under your business model, but you could sell the eggs themselves, right? They have value. So, if I take my prime costs, which is a combination of my materials that I bought and moving those materials into production, the portion of labor that takes them from the warehouse into the kitchen to bake the cake, right? Those are prime costs. Prime as in beginning. From the point where I start production, or start baking the cake, to the point where it's finished, so I've baked it, I've iced it, I've stuck it in the case to sell, it's still inventory for me, it's still an asset, but I've converted it now to a finished good. Does that make sense? Okay, So, here is the very, very big distinction. This class deals almost entirely on the balance sheet. So we do some things on the income statement, but we almost deal entirely on the balance sheet because all of these things, from the point where you buy the product to start manufacturing to the point where you finish it before it's sold, it's all an asset. It's just a different type of an asset. So everyone's okay when I say balance sheet and asset, you know what I'm talking about? Or do we need to go over it? Okay. So, after I have my product costs, then I have my next piece, which are period costs. So here's the difference. If these things all add together to make the product happen, my period costs are happening along the side so that my business can run. So my favorite example of this is Walmart. So does anyone have a love-hate relationship with Walmart in here? I do. I kind of love it. I have to appreciate it because their business model is so good, they make so much money. I just don't really like going in there these days, especially this one for some reason. So here's how Walmart works. The person who is in Walmart who's stocking the shelves, they're what type of labor? Direct or indirect? They're a direct labor, right? Because the service of Walmart is to sell goods. It's a retail store. So everything that happens in this Walmart store in Stephenville that's related to operations of that store is a direct cost. So when they order the goods to sell, that's direct materials. When they pay the people to stock the shelves or run checkout or run customer service or do whatever it is they do within the store, that's direct labor. The overhead is the lights, the AC, the security, the floor plan for the auto portion, right? All of that's overhead. All related to the function and operation of the Walmart store. So here's my question. Walmart over here in Stephenville, do they have an HR department?
1%.
Do what?
1%.
One person. How do you know that? Is it you?
No, I had a deal with them.
They were HR or they were customer service?
No, they were HR.
How so?
They were the one person I was able to go to send off my medical paperwork to not get fired, which I still ultimately ended up getting by pulmonary embolism.
Wow. Well, so that doesn't speak super well for Walmart, so we're gonna put that on hold for a second. They have one HR person, so let's go with that. Who does that HR person report to?
Sedgwick.
Subway?
Sedgwick.
Oh, no. Ultimately, who do they report to?
Corporate.
Corporate. Where's corporate? Not in Stephenville. Yes? Do you know where corporate Walmart is? Bentonville, Arkansas? Okay. All the accounting, all the HR in its entirety, so where the policies are driven from, happens in Bentonville, Arkansas. Those people get paid all throughout the year, salaries. Yes? Do those people have anything to do with what the Stephenville store does? Like literally nothing, right? So they do make deals as far as they negotiate prices with goods. You know you get your good into Walmart, right? Those of you who've had me before have probably heard this story. Literally, do you know how you get your good into Walmart? You go in and you beg them. It's not a joke. You go to Bentonville, Arkansas, you sit down in a cubicle with somebody who knows your company better than you, and then they tell you what they're willing to pay you for their good. And if you won't take it, you don't get to be in Walmart. If you're Coke and Pepsi, you fight continuously over shelf space. Like that's how it works. So none of that is driven by the people in the store, it's all driven by corporate. None of the operation is driven by corporate, it's driven by the people in the store. So the difference is the store is a product cost. HR, accounting, supervisory, all period costs. Here's the difference. This gets expensed per product. Period cost gets expensed as it occurs. So the HR person in Bentonville does not have to wait until the Stephenville Walmart sells something to get paid. They get paid on a schedule as their salary occurs. Does that make sense? Okay, so I have a question. What type of business do you understand the best, collectively, as a group? Grocery, retail, clothing, restaurant,
Fast food or retail? One of the two.
fast food or retail, what were you gonna say? It's unfair. Don't taunt me. Do it.
Retail or services.
So, like clothing? Okay. Anybody disagree? Anybody have a different type of store? So collectively, we've decided retail clothing. Okay. Where did you got that? Does the difference make sense? You promise? Because here's what happens. I ask if it makes sense, you nod at me, and then I give you something to do and you look at me like you've never heard about it before in your life. And I've never understood that dissonance because like I'm literally asking. I'm like pleading for you to tell me if it doesn't make sense. Because I realize you don't do this for a living. And you don't want to, most of you. And that's very evident on your face. Just this room in general is highly unenthused by managerial accounting. And I get it. I am unenthused by it as well. That's why I don't do it. You promise you get it? So if I give you a list of things right now, can you put it in all the categories? Are you confident? Now you look like that family on Family Feud that's at 0 while the other one is playing Fast Money. That's what's happening right now. Oh my gosh, did I get a laugh out of the personal trainer right here? Do you watch Family Feud? Have you? Yeah, it's okay. It's okay to admit. It's funny. Who's the best host of Family Feud?
Steve Harvey.
You can't just pick the one that you know. Do you know that there were others?
No.
Yeah. There were others.
But that just means that they weren't as good of a host.
They're dead. They phased out, literally, physically. They were like, sorry, NBC.
Live.
CBS. I don't even know who airs Family Feud. Who airs Family Feud? How do y'all feel about game shows? What's your favorite game show? These questions matter. They're going to show up later. I'm not just having a conversation with you, although that would be more fun than
Are you smarter than a 5th grader? That one's funny.
Okay.
Jeopardy.
Is that one that you, what would you play if you got to play a game show?
Jeopardy?
Jeopardy? What else? What?
I don't know.
Oh. It'd be kind of hard though. Have you ever seen The Weakest Link? It's hard though because I can't drop you through the floor.
What?
What's that one?
I saw it on Doctor Who.
Like the trigger, like was it chasing, like answer questions, three questions up to.
Oh, we could do
Chase?
that.
That was
Okay. We'll think about it. Okay, so this is way more complicated than I care to make it. I'm going to show it to you because it exists in the slides that I posted, but here's how it works. And this is what I want you to know, ultimately. Which is why I asked you if you're okay with the balance sheet. So, you know how to use a T account? Do you remember? It's been a long time. Some of you, if you had me for class, were like, we hate T accounts, they confuse us. If that's true, that probably is still true today. But everyone knows how to use one? Do I need to show you how to use one?
Slight refresher.
Show you? Okay. So, give me an account, a type of account. What? Yeah. Let's use cash. Does that work? Okay. Cash is what type of account? It's
Assets.
an asset. So its normal balance is what? Okay. So in my 2301 class, they're learning this today, quite literally, Monday and today. They're going to list the account name, the account type, asset, liability, or equity, right? And then its normal balance. Same is true in managerial accounting. We do far fewer journal entries because we're not producing financial statements for an auditor. But you do have to know what type of account you're dealing with because you have to understand what statement it's on. So what type of accounts go on a balance sheet? Asset, liability, or equity? All of them, right? Your balance sheet is your entire accounting equation. Yeah? What goes on your income statement? Revenues and expenses. What if I told you that your entire income statement is on your balance sheet? Would you buy that? It is true. So yes, you buy it. How does it work?
Revenues, equity, expense, and asset.
Okay, so when I get down and I say revenue minus expenses gives me gross profit, revenues minus cost of goods sold gives me gross profit minus expenses gives me net income. If I pay dividends out of that net income, everybody knows what a dividend is? Okay, so when I get this number, what is this number?
Retained earnings.
Beautiful. Retained earnings is what type of account? Asset, liability, or equity? Equity. So your entire income statement is in this section of your balance sheet. It's just little. It's one number instead of all of them. That's why you have to make your income statement before you make your balance sheet. Here's why this matters. You told me cash is an asset with a normal balance of a debit, right? We all remember the debits go on the left, credits go on the right always? Okay, the normal balance means the side that the account increases on. So if I debit cash, it means cash went up. If I credit cash, it means cash went down. Still with me? Okay, so a T account works like this. Every time cash changes hands, I record it on the side that it happened. So I'm gonna give you a scenario. So let's do it together. I invested, this is your company we're doing the T account for. I invested $50,000 in your company in exchange for common stock. What should I do in this?
What was it, 50,000?
50,000. I should debit 50,000, right? Okay, I know that every transaction has to hit at least 2 accounts. They don't have to be different types of accounts. So they can both be assets, they can both be liabilities, they can both be whatever, right? But it has to hit at least 2. So what is the other side of this particular transaction?
You would credit common stock.
I would credit common stock. So I know that I have to credit something so that it balances, right? Because my debits have to equal my credits. Why did I know to credit common stock? Because one, you knew you invested it, but what type of account is common stock? It's an equity account with a normal balance of a credit. So I got cash, investment went up, right? So both of these things increase. Does that make sense? Does the T account ring a bell now? Okay, here's why this matters. On my balance sheet is everything I buy to make my good. So, if I'm a cake baker, what goes on my balance sheet? All my ingredients. What do I call them? Okay, so in my inventory section, you remember what inventory is? What is inventory? What I'm selling, right? How I'm going to generate revenue. In my inventory section is everything I have related to my inventory. So you told me my direct materials go here. What else goes here? Okay, basically, yeah. So allocated direct labor. Okay, so once what do I call it when I take the direct materials and I start to process them?
Unfinished goods.
Also called
Work in process.
prime cost, also called work in process. Yeah? This means I haven't started. Is it your mom? Can I answer?
That was Walgreens.
Even better. I like to say, have you filled my makeup a prescription? Just to alarm the pharmacist. So, you told me prime costs, very good, right? So, prime costs, I have not started yet. I have taken these and started to produce them, but they are not in a condition where I can sell them. Once I finish these, what are they called?
Merchandise inventory.
Finished goods. All merchandise inventory. All of these things, as they move through in journal entries, stay on the balance sheet. Does that make sense? So let me give you an example. I'm not going to ask you for the journal entries on an exam, so you don't have to panic about this piece. I'm just going to ask you what's staying conditional. So it looks like this. If I purchase direct materials with cash on the 1st of the month, I'm going to buy raw or direct materials. And I'm going to say I buy 10,000 of them. and I bought them for cash. Is that all right? Asset, asset on the balance sheet. Does that make sense? When I start processing them 10 days later, I'm gonna move the portion that I started to process out of raw or direct materials. So let's say I started to process half. Where does it go? Work in process. Still on the balance sheet, asset, asset. Make sense? When I finish 5,000 of these 5 days later, I'm gonna move them out of work in process because they're not in process anymore. Where did they go? Finished goods. Does that make sense? So at the very beginning when I purchased this, if you had done your balance sheet, and I don't know how much you remember about a balance sheet, but a balance sheet is a snapshot in time. So as of a particular moment, a day, I take that. So day to day, your balance sheet balances could change. So on 1/1, my balance sheet looked like this. It had an inventory, it had a cash section, and it had an inventory section. In that inventory section was $10,000 of direct materials. Make sense? Okay, when I went down to 110, my direct materials became 5K, and my work in process, still in my inventory section, became 5K. Yeah? Then on 115, no more work in process, finished goods became 5K. The whole time, $10,000 worth of stuff is moving through the balance sheet. Question, how does it get off the balance sheet? I gotta sell it, right? So how do I know, word-wise, when it comes off the balance sheet? The word sold tells you, and the words cost of goods tell you. So all the costs that you are incurring, all the cash you are spending to move it, because you are spending money to move it from here to here to here. You're paying labor, you're paying for overhead, right? But you can't actually show it as anything but inventory until you sell it, because that's all it is to you. It's something you have that you have the right to generate revenue from. Until you generate the revenue, when you sell it, it's gotta stay on your balance sheet. Once you sell it, it moves off your balance sheet onto your income statement as cost of goods sold. Does the difference make sense? Maybe? Okay. So here's a little bit more of an explanation of that if you want it. So your raw materials inventory, also called your direct materials inventory, are materials that you bought that are waiting to be processed, pretty much untouched stuff, right, which is why we call them raw. Raw can mean anything in any context of business. So raw doesn't have to mean, like if you're a baker, raw doesn't have to mean like wheat that you grew. It could be flour, right? Someone else could have processed the wheat into flour. So raw is whatever you want it to mean in the context of your business. But raw means untouched. Work in process is partially complete, so I've moved some materials and used some labor to convert. And then my fully converted goods are finished, ready for sale, but still not sold. Feel okay with this? Okay, so this piece is where people get a little caught up generally, which is why I give you the actual format of it. If you work through the entries and you work through the problems, which we'll do some examples, if you work through the problems, it's fairly straightforward as far as like where things fall. But in a particular problem, I could give you any number of the variables and ask you to solve for an unknown one. So you just have to know how they work together. So here's the good news. How many formulas do you think you've written down in the last 2 days? Take a guess. Is it more than you care to memorize? Here's the good news. For this exam, every exam in fact in this class, I give you a cheat sheet that you can write whatever you want on. You can write a prayer on if you want to. You can write whatever you want on it. You just have to handwrite it. It's this size piece of paper, 8.5 by 11. You can fill both sides. So I don't want you to use your brain space trying to memorize that. I want to know if you can apply it after you read the question. So If you have the formulas and you prep the cheat sheet, then all you have to understand is how the things work together so that you can plug it into the formula. Sound like a plan? Does that allay the concern? For those of you that didn't know that I do that? Or no? Doesn't allay the concern at all? Remind me of your name, Yellow Stanley.
Madison.
Madison. Can I ask you why, are you generally unenthused or is it just me? I'm sorry. I'll check back next week when you feel better and ask you.
Could be the rain.
Do you need to go? You sure? Are you gonna make your, remind me what your name is? Why can't I keep this today? Just blank. Cricket? Wait. It would've been funny if it was cricket, because, you know, I asked. Are you gonna be pretty sick? Are you sure? Is she even your friend, or are you just stuck with her? Alright, I'm gonna leave that one alone. I'm sorry you feel bad. I'm mostly sorry that you're unenthused, but I'm really sorry that you feel bad, so. If you know this formula, you can do it. We'll do some examples where we actually add the stuff together, and we're not gonna walk through all of it today. We'll come back to that. Okay, so here is what I want to do really quick, and then we're gonna be done for today because that is the end of 14. So we've successfully covered 13 and 14, which means that I can now publish some of the homework stuff. Here's what I'm gonna tell you about the homework. It's going to ask you in a completely different way than I ask you. The point of that is so that you see both types of questions. I actually don't test over anything I don't lecture on. So if you were going to take a bet on what you would see, it's what I say versus what you saw in Connect. So if your whole thought process for this class is I'm just gonna do the Connect 4,000 times until I've memorized it, it's not a good method. Yeah? So if you have questions about the Connect, I'm happy to help you through those questions. If you send me a screenshot or you come show it to me, I want you to have the points for that. We're gonna do one real quick.
That's how my Tuesday, Thursdays are. Except for it's noon to 3. Yeah. It's fine. Only one class is on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's what mine today is. I'm not ghosting.
That's why you could stay on the phone.
Literally.
Yeah.
No, and she kept telling me that, and I was like, stop, like, because you know I can't say no.
Yeah. Did she just go to college?
No, she
Okay.
doesn't go to college. She's just
Try this
like,
one real quick for me.
what?
Okay, so obviously in a question like this, you would have answer choices. I'm not showing you the answer choices because I don't want you to work backwards for the time being. I want you to work forward. So, what do I start with? Depending on how well this clicks for you, I would start with what is cost of goods sold. Right? So you have to know what you're solving for. So if you don't know what cost of goods sold is, then doing the math for it is kind of like a free-for-all because I could give you 4 answers or 5 answers that are a combination of all of those numbers. If you don't know how they work together, you'd find an answer, it just wouldn't be that answer. Right? That's why I want you to work forward for right now. So what is cost of goods sold? It's not finished goods inventory. It's a good guess, but it's not finished goods inventory. Why?
Oh, it's right there.
What it costs you to make the good?
So, what cost me to make the good is a product cost, right? If I spent all of it to manufacture, it's a cost of goods manufactured, right? So when does it actually become a cost of goods sold? After I sell it. So how do I figure out what I sold?
Subtract the inventory from
Okay, so right now, I have to pay very close attention to dates, right? So what did I have at the very beginning? I had 31.7 at the very beginning. That's an 8. Now what?
subtract from
Subtract what from it?
the inventory at the end.
Which gives me what?
About 6,000.
Okay, but what is it? What does that give me?
It gives you what you sold and you probably
Gives me what I sold that I already have. I don't know that that helps me. I think I get what you mean, but I don't think that's what you mean.
Well, I would say the beginning plus what you made.
Okay.
Plus what you got left.
Why?
Because if we go ahead and add what you made, that's like your total inventory that you have.
Okay, so if I do what you did, which is very logical, I'm leaving out the fact that during April I made stuff, right? So I'm gonna take the 31.7 that I had at the beginning. This is what I started with. How did I get this number? I know that I gave it to you, but how did I get this number in reality? This was last month's finished goods, right? Still on my balance sheet, haven't sold it yet. I have 31.7 that I started with. I'm gonna add everything I made, which is how much? 126. What? 126. Okay. So I had this to begin with. I spent money buying the materials, spending the labor and the overhead to make this much during the period. At the end of the period, how much did I have? So this was left over, right? Which means that this number, which is the combination of these two, minus this number gives me what? What I sold. It's kind of like when you ask a kid, if you had 6 apples and you gave 4 to Sally, how many apples do you have left? Except I've added a component. You had 6 apples from last week. I gave you 4 more. Then you gave 6 to Sally. How many do you have left? That's what you're doing. How much I started with, how much I've produced, minus how much at the end of the period I still haven't finished goods. The remainder is what I actually sold. If it's not in finished goods, it has to be sold. That make sense? So what's the number? Yeah, it's easy to do. But you would have been close enough that it would have been like that's it. That make sense? So we could work our way backward from almost any one of those numbers and get the 3 numbers that were up top, which is why you have to know what you're solving for. Does the context make a little bit more sense now that you've seen a question? Okay, so when we come back, are you sure that you want to keep your final answer as Jeopardy is your favorite game? And, which is funny because final answer is a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire phrase, but we'll let it go. So Jeopardy is your favorite game and retail is your favorite type of store? Feel like betting on that? You sure? All right. Bye, have a good weekend.
Really?
Don't do
I do
anything
not wanna play
stupid. If you
Jeopardy.
do, call Jeopardy.